This section will give you the opportunity to try some models that can be applied. We're going to look at the different schools of thought on relationship marketing and then introduce the models developed by those schools and then critique them. And then at the end of it all, you get an opportunity to put one into use and try one out for yourselves. There's 3 schools of thought on relationship marketing. Literally 3 actual schools. The first is the Nordic school, and that's Gronrus and Gummison. So with the Nordic school, they very much believe that product differentiation becomes progressively more difficult in maturing markets. Therefore, long-term relationships based on service provision are the only way to get sustainable competitive advantage in the long term. They also feel that relationship management is cross-functional and the reliance on the core processes of interaction, dialogue, and value creation. So if you remember from the first and second lectures, we looked at that idea of boundary spanners, so that it's not just salespeople and marketers who are responsible for relationship management, but also those boundary spanners, those people that sit with both the customer and in the organization, so they can go between the two. So it can be engineers, it can be designers, it can be anyone who has customer contact. So the Nordic school feels that the relationship management is the responsibility of everyone within the organization. The second school of thought is the Anglo-Australian American school, AAA. Okay, so we've got the Webster and Wind paper that we put up for you to have a read. And the AAA school of thought focuses on the integration of quality management, all right, and the utilization of a service marketing concept, as well as looking at customer relationship economics. It utilizes the decision-making unit as a tactic for identifying customer strategy. All right, we're going to go into this in a great more depth next week with the customer buying process. The AAA model and the decision-making unit model is often criticized for indicating that relationship marketing is done to customers rather than with them. Okay, because there's so much structure involved in it, often it can become very prescriptive, and a bit like the 4 and the 7 Ps, it's considered in isolation. So who are these people? What do they need? How are we going to do it to them? Rather than that relationship building interaction. It's just a critique and something to think about. The Industrial Marketing Purchase Group, so this is Ford, Gada, Hackison, and the IMP group looks at the transactions between buyers and sellers and identify that they are not discrete, but they actually occur as a part of a continuing stream of interaction, okay, between many organizations. So this is where the idea of that business network comes into effect, that business ecosystem we looked at in the last section. Both the buyers and sellers here are believed to be active participants. And like we mentioned in the last section about that business ecosystem and how the buyer and the seller has to have that relationship to ease each other's concerns and uncertainties. So the IMP model is Scandinavian, so it's European in origin, and it's dynamic. Okay, so it can be like the view of the business ecosystem, it's unbounded. It's got very little boundaries between it. All the interactions happen between the organizations, that relationship's built. Everything's built on context, and it's understanding the context of that ecosystem and that business network to understand what's going on within it. Okay, it's very network centered. So it's not looking at the single organization and who's in it and how to lever their concerns, identify their problems and meet them. Actually, this is looking at that holistic ecosystem and network as a whole. And this is where we start bringing that systems approach to marketing. It's really rich and diverse. Because of this holistic view of it, the actual content, the problems, and the marketing itself becomes really rich and diverse in its nature, because you are considering that whole ecosystem. And you're looking at those relationships that happen where value is being added. And it's all about looking at those long-term stable relationships. Like I mentioned in the last section, it was very much reliant on those parties that were existent within those relationships, ensuring that there's that win-win, that both parties get value, both parties offset each other's uncertainties and actually help each other to grow and help everyone within the network to grow and learn from one another. So it's very long term, very stable. On the other side of the coin, you've got the North American context. And these are very static models. They're very, very rigid. And they're applied often within increasingly complex ways. And there's multiple variables that are considered, but it's more organization centric. So less network, more organization centric. And it's homogeneous. It's all looking at the same organization, the same types of buyers and how it can be applied to multiple buyers. So it's all the same, so it's homogeneous, okay, rather than the rich and diverse network problem solving of the IMP models. And in the AAA models, you're looking at that series of exchanges. So we're looking at that transactional marketing. And like I said, there's nothing right or wrong about this. I'm not saying either of these approaches are right or wrong. Each have their own application. So the more simpler product, if it's more of that traditional supply chain, transactional relationships, the buyer doesn't actually need to be educated, the seller is selling something fairly simple and don't need to exchange that knowledge, okay, the AAA can be applied. If it's looking at something very, very complex, something more diverse, something that needs the network as a whole to ensure the success of the business, so the Netflix example, IMP is applied. So you pick the model that's appropriate to your situation and organization. As such, we're going to look at the AAA model first. Because it's prescriptive and because it's firm-centric, we're going to look at that one first. And the model we're going to look at is the cultural web of the organization. So because it's so prescriptive, you have your headings that you look at and you work through them in series to understand what it is within that organization that you want to understand more about so that you can adapt your relationship marketing to suit that organization. So we look at the paradigm. So what are the core beliefs of that organization? What do they stand for? What's their mission? What's their vision? How is you as marketers able to tap into that to drive your messaging? What are some of the assumptions you make about that organization? Okay, and what kind of values do they have? Because as a marketer, you will then ensure, if you're approaching an organization with very specific values, that your salespeople, your boundary spanners, have that, share those values and can communicate those values and show that company that you have that same ethos and that you can work together. What symbols do they use? What kind of logos? What kind of cars do they drive? What's their language? Okay. So if you are talking to a startup, for instance, they might be bootstrapped. They might be working from a co-working space. They may be using Ubers all the time or even cycling. They may have very, very casual language and terminology. They may wear hoodies and jeans. If you go in with your suits and corporate language and corporate speak, and it just doesn't work. So by looking at what symbols the organization has, you can match that in yourself. And that's what the building the relationship is. It's understanding your customer, adapting your needs to it. The stories and myths, okay? What is it about the organization that how do they tell their stories? How do they tell their product? Do they have people, Steve Jobs, for instance, at Apple? Who's the hero? Who's the bad guy? And at times he was both. So it's understanding the context. And the rituals. Every organization has its rituals. You've all just been on placement. So I'm sure at least half of you have had the experience where they go, we just don't do it like that around here. Oh, that's not how we do things here. So it's understanding actually what is it that they do? How do things doing? Sometimes there's processes and knowledge, organizational knowledge that's so embedded. Settle. Sorry, my dog. Sometimes there's organizational knowledge and ways of doing things that are so embedded that people don't even need to think about it. It's just done. It's just how they do it, and it's taken for granted. And understanding those links within the organization. How are there certain rituals that happen? Does the whole organization stop on a Friday afternoon at 2:00 for beers and pool? What happens? Does the managing director play golf with the directors? Is that somewhere where you can go to influence their discussions? It's understanding what happens within that organization. Do the interns all go out for lunch every Thursday at 12 o'clock? Things that are going on. What kind of training, promotion, reviews are in place? Because by understanding that, you can tailor your messaging, and your product to actually support someone in getting their promotion. Network Rail was great for that because you had those individuals who were looking for that next step, that next promotion, and actually understanding how you can help your customer get that promotion by using your product. You can then tailor the messaging to suit. What kind of control systems are in place? Okay, so how are they rewarded? Do they get bonuses if they have no failures? Do they get what are their key performance indicators? By helping your customer meet their key performance indicators, you are instantly a good option in their eyes. Okay, and that by having that relationship, that's the only way you can do that. And what is the organizational structure? What's the formal ways of working? Now, every organization has its formal ways and informal ways, and this cultural web helps you to understand both. What are the power structures? Okay, so who holds the power within that organization? And don't automatically think it's the person with the title. Sometimes it can be the assistant, the personal assistant who controls the diary of the MD. He controls everything that they do. They know where they're at lunch. Sometimes knowing who wields the power and has the control can help you get that chink to get into that organization. And again, those power structures are very, very closely linked to that paradigm of the organization. All right. So looking at this is an example of the cultural web for marketing. So if we were going to look just at the marketing function, all right, how other parts of the organization often feel about the marketing function. So the paradigm is that they're unaccountable, they're untouchable, they're slippery, they're expensive, all right, that they're a cost center. Marketing just spends money, they just swan off to lunch all the time. We don't know what they do. And as marketers, especially in business to business, we need to be really good at communicating our value internally as well as externally, because whilst we do things in the dark, we can't show our value. And that's a skill to learn, especially as you progress and get promoted in an organization. So some of the symbols, marketing often go out for lunch. They have their own terminology. They have their doublespeak. They have flash cars. They often have nice offices. Not in some of the businesses I've worked in, but anyway, that's the joys of working with startups. What kind of stories and myths are available? Mud doesn't stick. They just chuck it out there. They're the golden child. Marketers often get promoted very quickly. There's no loyalty amongst marketers, and that they're expensive. What are the rituals? They plan, delegate, the deadlines, lots of off-site meetings. Control systems. Like we say, they work from 9 till 4:30. They go to lunch, they entertain, they travel all the time. They're networking to build their own profiles. And organizational structure, sometimes they lack that structure and that internal focus. They're always in meetings, okay? And the power structures, often marketing can be perceived as withholding research. They must be right, jargon and doublespeak, and the credit taken as if it's successful. Now, hopefully this isn't ever you as a marketer, all right? And hopefully I'm going to encourage you to be the best marketer you can be, and that none of these actually apply to you. All right, so if you've seen some of the things that I do for the marketing meetup, we talk all about, there's quite a lot of podcasts and support and how to actually communicate the value of marketing to the organization. It's a job in itself half the time. The second model we're going to look at is the IMP, from the IMP group, and that's the ARA model. Now, we have actually seen this model before. I used it in the last section just to introduce the concept, and now we're going to go into more depth with it. So this is the ARA model. What are the activities that take place? What resources are needed? And what are the actors that are in play? Now remember that this is for more than the business ecosystem. This is the business network that you're looking at. So this is where you start understanding your relationships from a network perspective. Okay, so first you look at what are the activities that are going on within this network? How many activities take place? How many partners do we have? Do you have different functions and activities that take place? I'm really sorry about my dog today. Sit, Tyson. Sit. Good boy. Okay. And what resources are needed? Do you actually share the resources with your partner? Okay. How are they tied to one another? And do you have shared manufacturing capability? Is the particular product only made for one customer? Where are the weaknesses? So what are the resources that the partners share or use? So remember, in that interconnected web of organizations, you're looking at it being beyond transactional. Okay, so the actors can actually work with each other to support you to deliver your end as the core business to produce your end product. How they tie to each other. And here you're looking for both the strengths within your system, but also potential failure points. So for instance, if a product is only being made for one customer, what's the incentive for that organization to continue making it and continue supporting it? Do you need to pay that little bit more to ensure that that product will still be made and supported, just to ensure that your product will survive in the long term? And what are the actors that exist within it? Okay, and what are the connections and social ties between them? And how powerful are they for maintaining that relationship? Okay, is it all about work, or is there leisure time as well? Are there networking events that you go to? Do you go to trade shows? What else goes on? How are those relationships built and maintained? And to do that, you then map it for each of your relationships. I've got 2 examples here, but it goes on and on for as many as you need. All right, so with each relationship, with each supplier, you'll understand what's going on by using the model. IMP has a number of implications, okay, both positively and negatively. And as a part of this whole lecture is about critiquing the models. And I really want you to think about it in a way that actually what works, what doesn't, can you always apply it? I really need you to be critical about what you're applying to make the right decisions as to which models you'll use. Okay. And the IMP is better than the ARA in some instances because it's a better representation of the world, and it understands that relationships are progressive, all right? And it understands that by implementing relationship practice, quality can be improved. So if you remember back to the Marks and Spencer example, where they actually put in place formal controls for their relationships to improve the quality of their end product, and actually put in place those formal arrangements for meetings, follow-up, feedback, performance benchmarking, improvement, and then actually if the person couldn't improve, how to actually get them out of that and to end that relationship without impacting on the delivery of the product. It ignores the needs of the buyers and the characteristics of the sellers. Okay, it's often involved with, it identifies the self-interest of firms and managers, and it doesn't take into account the unpredictability of relationships. Relationships are all between people, and it sounds so obvious, but sometimes when that person moves on to a new promotion or a new business, the relationship dies with them. And if you can't make a relationship with a new person coming in, or if they bring their old agency or their old suppliers, often that relationship lives or dies with that cheerleader within the business. Okay, models are limited because it doesn't understand that predictability. Now, the IMP model that we looked at starts to take into account that research aspect that we introduced in the last area. So we looked at that macro research, what is the environment that the organization exists within, and then that micro analysis. Okay, and we start looking at what is it that's going on. And this was from Huskisson, and it started to challenge the 4 assertions that were around at the time in 1982. And if we remember back to the first lecture where we discussed the evolution of marketing, in the 1980s there was a lot more competition and markets were starting to mature. Technology was developing exponentially and driving changes in the way that businesses operate. And their business models started to change as a whole. Okay, the first challenge was the idea that business sales or purchases would be sensibly considered, okay, as isolated events involving the customers that entered and then left the market for a particular product. Right? So again, this is very much that transactional marketing. It led us to the idea that the task for researchers was to try and understand the relationships, and for the companies, it was to try to manage them, right? Manage those relationships. Secondly, Harkinson challenged the idea that marketing consisted of independent action by a supplier in constructing its marketing mix and projecting it at that passive market. So like we critique those 4 and 7 Ps of the last traditional marketing mix in the last section, this was developed as a step on from that. Okay, and this was developed in a way to help address some of those limitations and to look at that interaction process between those two organizations, but also looks at the individual that exists within them. So it moves away from that concept of one organization talking to another and starts looking at that. Who are the individuals? What are they aiming? What their experiences? What does the win look like to them? What does success look like? And that organization that's offering the service or product, supporting them in delivering that. Okay, and building those relationships. Thirdly, it was challenged that the idea that customers can be considered as a homogeneous atomistic group. Okay, the customers are all the same and that they can be bunched together. And this takes it on that step, and that we've found that companies interacted with are relatively stable, but they are heterogeneous. Okay, and and you find that the relationships are different, and there's different customers and different suppliers within those business networks. Finally, they challenged the idea that it was possible to make sense of either the marketing or purchasing process by considering them separately. So often organizations were looked at of how do they buy products? Okay, we will then market them in this way. All right? Looking at them in isolation often missed those nuances that exist. Instead, we'd like to emphasize the similarity of the tasks in which both parties were engaged. So trying to look at which tasks both organizations conducted and did well in and enhancing that. It comes back to that in the last section we looked at customer value. What is it that the customer values, and do that. No more and no less. So you start taking that nuanced and bespoke approach. And it's making sure that things happen simultaneously, analysing both the buying and the selling sides of the relationships. Okay, so what can we do as marketers to improve how we do our job? How can we improve the relationships that we're building? What can we do to enhance it? What can we do to close, to close the gap in expectations? What is it that our customer expects from us, and how can we fulfill those expectations or manage them? Sometimes it's not about fulfilling them, it's about managing them.